Good evening. Looks like we're live, so we'll get this started. According to my computer, it's 5:30. I'm your host this evening. My name is Joe Maghe, and I'm doing this presentation on behalf of the show Caretakers. It's sponsored by the Civil War Photos Collector Society, which is directed by Doug York and Ron Coddington. They also wanted me to let everyone know that you can view this presentation and others on Civil War Faces and on the Caretakers YouTube channel. They sent me a series of questions. Oh, one thing before I forget. Some of you may not recognize me if you've seen me before, so I'll make sure I have on my flat cap. They sent me a series of questions, and they wanted me to explain a little bit of how and when did I become a Civil War collector. A Civil War image collector, to be specific. I first collected images back in the 80s. There was no internet, and so we basically subscribed to lists, if you would. Some had photographs, some didn't. You found a photograph you liked or read the description and thought you might like it. You sent them some money. They sent you the image, and then you had a 3-day inspection privilege to see if it was really something that you would like. As I said, I began collecting photographs in the late 80s. I started off initially as a sword collector in the early 80s, and then through a series of events I just kept on broadening out my horizons, and still yet to this day I collect a wide variety of items, only some of which are Civil War images. They asked me about having any special memories of my early days of collecting. For me, some of the special memories are finding an image that had a special story connected to it about the individual. I love identified images more so than I do rare images or something along that line. The ID, the history of the individual drives my collecting interest. I also have some special memories of finding photographs that were unidentified and then finding the identity of the individual at that time or at a later date. They asked me about what type of lessons have I learned, and that is to do your homework and to be prepared. I don't always have all the money I'd like to have to spend on the hobby, so I have to be smart about how I do my shopping and purchasing. As far as some wise advice that I have received, I would have to say it doesn't matter what you pay for an article as long as you're happy with it. But then in the same regards, that article is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it after you. As far as future plans as a collector, I continue to seek out the images of Irish and Irish American soldiers who served in the Civil War, and also to supplement that when I can't find something in that line with men who served in the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, primarily fought in the city or the bridge crossing or below Marie's Heights. As for a mentor, I never really had a mentor. I live in the great state of Kansas, but we're kind of removed from all Civil War activity except for the battle at Baxter Springs in October of 1863. So there were really no Civil War collectors in this area when I got started. So having a family, not being able to travel to shows, living in Kansas, lack of internet at that time, I just kind of had to learn on the fly by the seat of my pants. They also ask, what advice would I give to young collectors? I'd have to say probably, no matter what you're collecting, find a trusted advisor. And if you can find fakes, forgeries, counterfeits, examine them in detail, because only by seeing these and handling them will you be able to learn on your own of what is right and what is not. Also, try to find a niche, a specialty. But sometimes it's like chasing the wind unless you have really deep pockets and a lot of cash. It's somewhat of a Well, to tell a better story, many, many years ago, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, traveling, taking the kids to Disney World or something, driving vacation. And when we got into Memphis, we went to a place called Gentleman's Antiques, which was an old warehouse type affair. And the man running it sat there. It looked like something out of a Humphrey Bogart movie. Little short, squatty, bald-headed guy, wire-rimmed glasses, single bulb over his head. I picked out several silverware items off of his dusty shelves, and he specialized in military items, Indian artifacts, and naval items. And so as I walked up to pay for them, he paused from his bookwork, pulled down his glasses onto the bridge of his nose, stared at me and said, "It's kind of like an addiction, isn't it?" And I knew he was right. And from that time on, I was definitely hooked for sure. Okay, so we'll start off now. The first image that I ever saw, I wasn't able to acquire it at that time, was in 1960. I was about 8 years old, and my mom and my dad, or my mom and my sister rather, had gone to an auction. We'll see if we got that adjusted right. We got a little bit of a time delay here. And this was what I found in this old wooden farm wagon that my sister purchased a lot of junk out of. The auctioneer had said who would give him a bid on this just wagon load of miscellaneous items. She did. They boosted me in, and that image was in there. It never was mine. It was always hers. But in 2003, a tornado hit her house and flattened the house, and I just figured that Civil War image was gone. But lo and behold, about 10 years ago, my sister showed up for Thanksgiving dinner and brought me this. I was so pleased to finally be reunited, if you would, with that old photograph. I couldn't hardly believe it. Another photograph that came to me many years later, because I was still mixing my time between being a sword collector and photographs and all kinds of different things, ephemera. It didn't matter if it was Civil War and it struck my fancy. I wound up buying it if I could. This is a photo of George Keyes of the 41st United States Colored Troops and one of his partners. Another officer of the regiment, I presume, but we really don't know. Nothing special about Keyes, but I just really liked the image with the pipes and the tinted flag and whatnot. It just really kind of struck my fancy. So I had to have it. And this is the image in its original case. We'll switch around now and look at some CDVs from my collection. As I said, my primary interest is in the Irish, but I also like somewhat unusual items. And this is one of those that fits the bill in both cases. This is none other than Lieutenant James McQuillan of the 29th Massachusetts. The 29th Massachusetts was an honorary Irish regiment because they served with the Irish Brigade early on in 1862. They served with them at the Battle of the 7 Days and also at Antietam. Lieutenant McQuillan has an interesting history, but the main thing that I liked about him, this is the only photo I have of an albino. I have seen one other photo of him post-war, probably 15 years post-war. His hair is grown out, and he has a very similar pose, but he has a carnival-type shirt on. So I had to snatch that up since I figured I wouldn't have too many other opportunities to pick up a photo of an albino soldier. Several years ago, I got to know Scott Hahn, and he identified an image in my collection for me. I had an image of an officer standing with a sword out of its scabbard, but the strange thing was the scabbard was a telescoping or collapsible steel scabbard. I had a sword just like that in my collection that was identified to another Pennsylvania officer, and he told me who that was, and we got to talking, and so I traded him just about all my good Gettysburg casualty images for a series of Irish soldiers and some of the casualties from Fredericksburg of 1862. This particular image is Lieutenant Francis Brennan of 97th New York. He was killed in the wilderness. He was active very early on in the Fenian cause. Those of you that don't know about the Fenians, I'm sure you can look it up on Google and they'll tell you a lot more than I have time to discuss here. But they were basically an Irish revolutionary group and hoped to get the independence of Ireland from England. This image is Garrett Nagel. One thing I like about Mr. Nagel's image, let's see if we can zoom in here a little bit, or maybe I could just bring it in. Maybe that might be easier. If you look at his hat, it has the number 1 within a wreath of shamrocks, and above that number 1 is the number 69. The 69th New York was the 1st Regiment of the Irish Brigade. Nagel was wounded at Antietam, and in fact, this photograph was just taken maybe 3 weeks afterwards. He was severely wounded in the shoulder, and the image is taken on October 11th of 1862 and given with the date in 1865. Nagel finally came back to duty with the 69th back in January of 63, and he was able to be with the regiment at Chancellorsville, but shortly after that he was discharged for his disabilities and entered the Veteran Reserve Corps. These two fine fellows, this gentleman's a chaplain, this gentleman is a captain. This is one of those images that I take, or I collected, because of their connection to the Battle of Fredericksburg. Scoot that back there a little bit for you. Getting some glare, I'm sorry. On the left we see Chaplain Fuller. Chaplain Arthur Buckminster Fuller. He was a Unitarian clergyman, and he was chaplain of the 16th Massachusetts. He had just applied for a discharge before the Battle of Fredericksburg began, but as the troops crossed over the river and began the fighting in the streets of Fredericksburg, Chaplain Fuller knew he had to do something other than go home. He crossed the river and found an officer of the 19th Massachusetts. That officer was Monsignor Dunn of the 19th. He went to Captain Dunn and said, "Give me a rifle." So, lo and behold, Captain Dunn said there was no time like the present and that the chaplain should take his place on the left. Captain Dunn went on to say that Fuller was very cool and collected, and he thought he would have good service from the chaplain. They were directly in front of the grocery store, and the chaplain fell within the first 5 minutes after having fired his rifle once or twice. He died instantly on the spot. His first wound went to his hip, and then the killing shot was to his upper body. This is one of those, has a very sad story connected to it. I always term this as a love story amidst the carnage of Fredericksburg. Here you see a gentleman that served in the 4th Ohio Regiment. His name was James Wallace. He was a captain in that regiment. The 4th at the Battle of Fredericksburg were one of the 3 regiments that acted as skirmishers and tried to follow up the Confederate skirmishers to the stone wall. Needless to say, that didn't work out, and all of them were hit very hard by musket fire from behind the wall and artillery from the heights. Wallace was badly wounded in the leg, and a letter is written about him later, and I'll just kind of give you a quick read of the letter. It was written by a soldier by the name of Love in the, let's see, what was he in? The 8th Kentucky Volunteers. February 8th, 1863, the letter begins. Well, Molly dear, what am I going to say to you now? I can tell you of a heroine, our Major Schneider, a good and devoted fellow, honest and independent, and a warm friend, had a friend, a captain in an Ohio regiment, this was Wallace, who was engaged for some years to his sister. The captain's name is James Wallace. He got his knee mashed by a cannonball at Fredericksburg, but would not have it amputated for weeks. He was reported dying and said that his fiancée should go to see him, but before she could start, news came that he was better, and so she did not go. But her father did. In about 10 days it was seen that the amputation must be performed, and as soon as she knew it, she went on to nurse him and keep his courage up. She arrived early one fine morning in January, and soon it was amputated, and he was doing well and in good spirits. But she found that she could not wait on him as she wished, because she was not a relative or nurse. So in order to do so, she was married to him before noon the same day, sitting by his bed by a Washington divine there at hand. All went well under her kind care until nightfall. Then she left for supper. 5 minutes later, the nurse saw a spot of blood. The knot on the artery had given away, and he bled to death instantly, before either his newly married wife or the doctor could arrive. Such is the life. Such is one of the many tragedies enacted daily now in our distracted country. Truly, those who die on the field suffer least. Badly wounded are many whom bullet or bayonet never reach. Thus, maid, wife, and widow in one day. She and her father took the corpse home to Ohio, and from her father's house there was the largest funeral in that section ever known. Is she not a heroine? With much love, my dear Molly, to self and all, I am ever yours, Love. And how many other untold stories like that, that we never hear, but I just had to have that image once I learned his story. Let's see if I can get a better angle on this. This is a tintype, and I purchased it because his battery action at Fredericksburg. And a little later, I found out that he, in fact, was Irish himself. This is William Dennis of Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Artillery. They were far in advance of the town of Fredericksburg on the 13th. They were one of the artillery batteries that went outside the town and went partially up the heights and began firing on the stone wall. Dennis survived that battle, and at the Battle of Fredericksburg, he survived it. But in the wilderness, he was once again in the thick of the fighting. And a clip from a Providence Journal newspaper tells us a little bit about him. It says, they have been engaged severely during the recent battle. In the Battle of the Wilderness, not all woods, and this battery took position in an open space in the advance line. In that battle, Private William Dennis and Private Ezra Fowles were killed. Private Dennis was a veteran. His left leg was torn off at the thigh by a solid shot. "Somebody take my sponge staff" were the only words that he uttered. This is an enlargement of the image so you can see a little bit better detail perhaps. Sticking with the Battle of Fredericksburg, we have a gentleman by the name of Joseph Bridgman Curtis. He enlisted in September of 1861 as a first lieutenant in the 4th Rhode Island. 6 weeks later, he was commissioned in the field and staff. And in Fredericksburg, the 4th Rhode Island was one of the regiments that were the last to go up the heights before nightfall. He was killed at Fredericksburg on December 13th while attempting to reorganize his regiment after they had become separated from each other. According to some, Curtis was mounted, which was against orders, I do believe, and he was killed when a shell burst over him and his horse while he was doing so. Other accounts say that he was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. But irregardless, Curtis died that day. Earlier we talked about finding images that you recognize, but they're unidentified when they're for sale, and that is the case here. A few years ago, there was a lot in an auction of 18 images, and in the initial photo, those 18 images were just kind of fanned out, if you would. And I saw the image on the right and immediately recognized it as John H. Donovan of the 69th New York. Some of you may have seen the photo on the left of Donovan when he was serving on the Veteran Reserve Corps. He lost his eye and part of his ear in the battles of the 7 days. And once again, I hope not to bore you, but I'm going to read you an excerpt of a letter that he wrote. At that time, he was in Bellevue General Hospital in New York City, and the date was July 26, 1862. Beloved General, I cannot describe you the pride and contentment I experienced on ascertaining through the newspapers the news of your arrival in this city. I felt assured that you had escaped the storm of July 1st, unharmed, notwithstanding your exposed and conspicuous position while leading your gallant band to the contest. I came here on the Vanderbilt. I was a prisoner in Richmond for 18 days, during which time I suffered intensely from my wounds. The humiliation of being in rebel hands in a scorching fever. But when delivered from the contagion of their despotic atmosphere and placed under more of the old flag, I became revived and refreshed and have been on the gain ever since. I received a very severe wound during our second engagement with the enemy. This was at Malvern Hill. While in the act with other officers of rallying our left wing, which was being hard pressed, and on the point of being outflanked by a numerous force of the enemy, a ball carried away part of my right ear entering the skull and passing through the right eye, totally destroying it. When taken to the hospital, the doctors pronounced it fatal, but I was determined not to give up the ship. The next morning, the 2nd of July, I found myself totally eclipsed, and remained so for days. Generals Hill and Magruder visited the wounded that morning after battle. General Hill went round to several officers and demanded their sidearms and revolvers, which they then delivered up with reluctance. The general demanded mine, and I told him I had taken occasion to have them sent to my regiment the night previous. He replied that from the apparent nature of my wounds, I wouldn't have much need of them in the future. I told him that I had one good eye left, and that I would risk it in the cause of the old Union, and that should fate deprive me of that, I would go it blind until the rebellion was put down and the supremacy of the federal government established. He asked me the name of my regiment, and I told him the name of my regiment and the brigade with the greatest pride, when the general quietly passed away. I was told at Richmond they had known the precise whereabouts of the Irish Brigade on the field, that they would have sent a whole division to take itself and General Marr's prisoner, and hang the exiled traitor from the highest tree in Richmond. I told them that they would need several divisions to accomplish that job, and even then they couldn't do it. He goes on to close and finish out the letter. I'd seen the letter before I was able to buy the images, and there is one more image that exists, and I've tried to acquire it on multiple occasions to no avail, and that is probably a later 1862 image of Donovan, where he has, instead of having a gauze patch over his eye, he has his eye patch on, but his uniform is slightly different. But once again, I love stories and I love the Irish. These fine fellows all had something to do with the Civil War, as well as the 1860 battle in Italy. In 1860, the Italian city-states were trying to unite into a uniform country. The Pope did not want that and called for the help of all faithful Catholics to come to his aid. Many from Ireland snuck out of Ireland to do that, but they had to sneak out. They couldn't do it under the auspices of what they were actually going to do. So here you see a man in a clerical uniform. This is a Catholic archbishop. His name is Dagger John Hughes. He was an Irish immigrant, and as I said, he became Archbishop of New York. And he was notorious for defending the rights of his Irish and trying to better their lives through education in general, education of the Catholic faith, and getting them to resist drink and get jobs. Next to him, you see I'm sorry, one moment. You see John Gleeson. John Gleeson was one of those that defended the Papal States. He went on to serve in the 63rd New York during the Civil War. He was one of the first to arrive, in fact, in 1861, and he enlisted in the 69th New York State Militia under Company K, Thomas Francis Marr. He survived that battle, and he was a giant of a man. He stood about 6 foot 6 inches tall and was a very imposing and boisterous figure, we're told. Another man that came over early was the man in the center of the photo here. His name is Patrick Clooney. He also went on to join Company K of the 69th New York State Militia and served quite well during that battle at Bull Run. He, however, enlisted in the 88th New York, and he was always at the forefront of his company and regiment. He was often reported as carrying the flag in advance of his men, and it was just that he was doing at the Battle of Antietam when he was shot. In fact, he was shot several times. Most of his color bearers had already been shot down, and Clooney had already been wounded in the knee, but in spite of that, he grabbed one of the color staffs and he was using it as a crutch and trying to hold it aloft. As he waved the flag, encouraging his men, he was hit twice more. This time he was killed instantly when one shot hit him in the head and the other through his heart. Daniel Keeley was the next to arrive. Sorry, my camera fell off the stand. Here you see the officer in the uniform of the Papal Zouaves in 1861 before he came to America. He came to America and he immediately went into the officials and said he wanted to be an officer in some regiment. He had a lot of pull with some authorities, and so he was assigned to General Shields in the Shenandoah. 2 months after joining Shields' staff, he was in the thick of fight one day when he and a small force tried to lead a charge against a superior Confederate group. And even though he was on horseback, he led the way and was wounded quite badly in the jaw and laid up. After that, he was decommissioned. He went south, formed a Louisiana cavalry regiment, and never really got to serve with them. It was absorbed into another regiment. Keeley would be reported to have an affair with none other than the Confederate spy Belle Starr. He stayed in America after the war, died in Louisiana on a plantation, and his gravesite is unknown. The last person we have here is Lieutenant John Dillon Mulhall. Served with the Papal Forces in 1860. Then he came later on. He came in the late 1862 after Fredericksburg. And it's mentioned that he was at the Requiem Mass for the dead of Fredericksburg in January. Marr thought quite a bit of him because of his reputation, and he served them quite well, being twice wounded after that in the war. This is one of those marriages, if you would. I had this letter. It was written February 7th of 1863. And the letter says in brief, "Dear Captain Cartwright, I'm happy to leave today that your resignation went through without the least problem." What this is in regards to is the gentleman here, Thomas W. Cartwright. He lied about his age so he could serve. We hear sometimes about young men lying about their age so they can serve in the armed forces, but this gentleman was 57 years old, quite old for a Civil War soldier. So he lied and told them that he was 40 years old just so he could get into the military. He was wounded at Antietam, and he was wounded again in the side at Fredericksburg. His son, Thomas Jr., had heard this. He had heard that his father had been killed, actually. And so Thomas Jr., who had been wounded some months before, decided to try to find his father's body and take him home. That's an Ambro of Thomas Jr. He was so weak from his wound and the stress of hearing that his father was killed, it took its toll on him, and he passed away. And because of his passing, that was what merited the elder Cartwright to offer his resignation. He went on to say, "The hardships and privations of a campaign of 17 months has made sensible and very serious inroads upon my health, resulting in general prostration of strength and incipient pneumonia. My age also, now 60 years, prevents me from fulfilling the duties of my position with satisfaction to myself, on advantage to the service. The recent sudden death of my youngest son, Captain Thomas W. Cartwright, Jr., 5th New York State Volunteers, has produced painful results in my family, rendering my presence with them imperative." And so that was the reason in this letter that the writer said the elder Cartwright resignation had been accepted. He went on to say in a postscript at the bottom of the letter, "Poor young Emmett is dead. For a long time I had no idea who poor young Emmett was, until one day I saw this image offered for sale. Appears to be a cavalry officer. In fact, I've seen other images, or one other image of him offered as a cavalry officer. But this is Lieutenant Richard Riker Emmett. So that was kind of special. He did not serve too long. He had contracted a disease, the same disease as his brother. And so young Emmett served just a matter of months before he died and was shipped home. I believe it was typhoid fever that he had had as well. And the last image we see here is one of those that we have to do our homework on. I do not have any way that I can prove it as of yet, but I bought this image because I believe this may be a image of John Jack Gleeson, who was an adjutant of General Thomas Francis Meagher. There's several things that lead me to believe this, and he was decommissioned in 1863, and so I still have a lot of work to do. It may just keep on being an unidentified image, but it was worth a small price to find out. Now we'll move into some other oddities, at least oddities for me. This is one of the two groupings I have. I used to have three, but traded one away. This is a scrapbook page, and the albumins are laid onto a heavy card-like material, and in faded ink below each one is their name written. All of these men served in the 57th New York. Early war-style uniforms to boot. Here we see one of those groupings that I get so fond of picking up from time to time. This gentleman is, here you can see a modern day photograph, and somebody in their family or another collector has it. This is Fleck in his artillery uniform of the 30th New York Light Artillery. And that is an enlargement of that photo. He was born in Germany, came to America, and enlisted in the 20th New York State Militia. After the war, he moved to Salina, Kansas, and became a watch and jewelry maker and repairman. There you can see him in his later years in his shop, his Jewelry Emporium in Salina, Kansas. This is a large card of his battery, the 30th New York. A little bit of snow on the ground. There's an enlargement of it. That is Fleck right here, leaning on the hilt of his sword. Here you can see the officers and their dog. Like that. Fleck was wounded 5 times during the war. He was a tough old bird. In fact, he was wounded before Richmond by a piece of tree that had been hit by a shell, and then it burned his flesh and tore his arm open from the tree splinters. He also had a flesh wound on the neck at Gaines Mill. At Fredericksburg, his horse kicked him in the left knee. It broke his kneecap. At Chancellorsville, he was wounded in action when a piece of shell hit his right knee. Then at Newmarket, his left kneecap was again hit by a piece of shell. And then to end it all, later in the war, he was captured by Mosby's men while on scout near Charlottesville, Virginia, but he escaped 11 days later. That is an old pass from the commanding officer of his battery that he decided to keep for some reason. Here we have one of those things that I love to piece them together. The spider's web reaches far and wide. There's a CDV of Robert Nugent, Colonel of the 69th New York. Let's see if I can get rid of that glare. This is a letter and pay sheet for a Lieutenant Cahill of the 69th New York. What it was Nugent penning the letter certifying that Lieutenant Lawrence Cahill, Company B, was wounded and taken prisoner at the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 1st, 1862, that he has since been paroled and is now honorably discharged. That is Cahill's cane. Above we see an enlargement there of Cahill, and that is the ambrotype of Cahill, his Irish Brigade Veterans Ribbon, and a silver harp cap badge that were all belonging to him. This is kind of a neat old book, well worn. It did not come with the photograph, but I had to reunite it with the photograph. Let me see if I can shoot a little better photo of this. Nope. Kind of an unusual pose of General Thomas Francis Marr, commanding general of the Irish Brigade. The reason I picked up the book is in the flyleaf there are annotations. In fact, there's annotations throughout the book in pencil and pen. But here it says Bolivar Heights, Marr's Brigade, October 1862. I picked this book up many years ago for little of next to nothing just because of the inscription. Not been able to validate whose hand it's in, but I held on to it anyway. This was the fellow that was the focus of my Irish collection. I started collecting Irish items in 1986. And the reason I started, as I said, I was a sword collector. There was this sword, and when I purchased it, and it was shipped to me, well, I knew it was inscribed, but I didn't know anything about the Irish or much about inscribed swords. In fact, it was my first inscribed sword. It was inscribed from, or to, Captain Michael McGuire on his promotion from lieutenant to captain in May of 1862, when the 69th New York State Militia had been called to active duty again. He had served in 1861 at the Battle of Bull Run as an orderly sergeant, but then after the Irish Brigade was forming, he chose not to join the Irish Brigade, but to wait on Colonel Corcoran to be released from prison, and he joined Corcoran's Irish Legion. This photo that you see an enlargement of there has a long, lengthy inscription on the reverse. It says, Captain Michael McGuire, taken 3 months after the Battle of Antietam, shot through the lung and liver, and was in every battle which the Irish Brigade participated in. He received from $250 to $300 pension a year as Lieutenant Colonel of the 184th Regiment and Captain of the 69th Regiment, Corcoran's Irish Legion, with the compliments of Mrs. M.L. Moriarty. And the photographer is William Clausen. Now, this is one of those where I said, do your homework again for the younger collectors. There were so many things wrong with what was written on the back that it would really be pretty ambiguous. One, Michael McGuire never served in the Irish Brigade. Two, he wasn't shot at Antietam. His regiment wasn't even at Antietam. He served in the 182nd, which was better known, or the 69th New York National Guard Artillery of Corcoran's Legion. He didn't serve in the 184th. So it's like, wow, this is all messed up. But I had already researched his archive records and knew that the Mrs. M.L. Moriarty was his sister. And I knew the photographer was the husband of his second sister. So here we have a photograph inscribed by his sister, taken by his brother-in-law, and we've reunited it with his sword, with his pay sheet, and with a letter from his wife to him in the field. Above that we have a Xerox copy of the statement where he was presented the sword on May of 1862 by his men. Sorry for the movement. Hope you're not seasick, and hold on, because here we go. This is a large grouping of items. As I said, I live in semi-rural Kansas, and there's not a lot of Civil War items around here. So one day I was looking at a newspaper ad, and it said, basically a state auction, tintype of Civil War soldier. So I went to this auction and walked to one of the tables, and there was that full plate colorized tintype. And I asked the lady, I said, "Are you the sister of the lady that passed?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Can you tell me anything about this image?" She goes, "Oh, what? Well, sure, yes. She goes, "Come out here." So we went out, and she goes, "That's my great-great-uncle Asbury Thompson." And she said, "And that is his brother Hugh." So I can get away from the glare. Hugh Thompson. And that is Hugh and Asbury's mother. So I looked at her and said, "Hugh L. Thompson?" And she said, "Yes, that's correct." I immediately recognized, because of my work on the Baxter Springs Historical Museum, Hugh L. Thompson was stationed at Fort Blair at Baxter Springs in 1863 when they were attacked by Quantrell's men. After the war, he wrote this booklet detailing his service in southeastern Kansas and southwestern Missouri. This is a photo of him just after the war in civilian garb. His discharge, and Asbury's discharge. Also included at a later date was an enlarged solar image or drawing of one of his sisters, and his other sister and her husband, Daniel Shepard. Daniel was interesting because he never served in the Wisconsin regiment with his brothers-in-law, but rather he rode with Jim Lane early on in the troubled times. And at the bottom of that is a statement from Lane saying about his service. She also asked me if I wanted to buy some other items. She said none of her family members wanted them. That is Patrick Mcnary, an Irish immigrant that served with the 3rd Wisconsin. At the Battle of Baxter Springs, he was out with Pony Johnny Fry and Lieutenant Cook, where they were discharging their weapons, doing some target practicing, and those 2 men were killed, but Mcnary was captured by a group of Quantrell's men. He escaped 3 days later and made it back to Union lines. Another interesting image is this one. It's of a young Kansas man who is a person that served in the 2nd Kansas Artillery. I believe that's correct. Yeah. He was on a foraging expedition into an area near Sherwood, Missouri in 1864 when they were surprised by a group of partisan rangers. Some men from the 2nd Artillery were with some of the men from the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, and because of that, they spared no one, and the raiders killed everybody they could. In fact, Thompson himself was shot 5 times and left for dead before he could make it back to the lines with the help of some people in the area. Thompson was very active in Veterans Affairs afterwards, and that's him wearing his GAR medal. And also there is a roster of people that attended the reunions at the Soldier and Sailors grounds in Baxter Springs, Kansas. Okay, we'll try to go out here and finish up. Okay, this was a grouping of images that I really liked and didn't know much about it, but I purchased them anyway. George Washington Pettis. He served in the 137th New York, but then he was detailed to Knapp's Battery of Pennsylvania. He served with them from April of 1863 through Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and all their other actions until the end of the war. Don't know why he transferred other than his pre-war occupation was as a blacksmith. And it was said that he was a teamster sometimes and a blacksmith sometimes for the battery. This is an image of Pettis without his shirt. I don't know if blacksmiths normally did that or if he was a boxer as well, but not too imposing of a figure, but shirtless nonetheless. Another image of him in civilian garb, and one of him in his very early years. This is an image of his wife and his first daughter. This is an image of his second daughter's in-laws. Love the blue background on this ambrotype. Just really striking, I thought. That's another image of some of his second daughter's relations on the Shelt and Jameson side. And then I really, really like this neat little Oreo case of Pettis on the right and an unidentified person on the left. Complete with the little mother of pearl inserts. Just really sweet, I thought. Here we have one of those strange stories once again. It seems like I have a lot of strange stories. This is William Butler. Many years ago I'd seen an article about a Mrs. Ottaviano in Schenectady, New York. She had found a trunk of items, including a tintype, a CDV, a bunch of letters, a sword, and everything of this gentleman. So I immediately wrote to her and asked her if I could acquire them. She'd already given the letters to the university, but she was holding on to everything else. My wife contacted her to see if she could buy them to give them to me as a Christmas present, a birthday present. And Mrs. Ottaviano was gracious enough to make a Xerox copy of the CDV and send that to me and say basically, nope, I don't want to sell them ever. So I held that as the only representation of Captain Butler at that time. And then some time went on, and this CDV showed up. I was able to find this CDV at an auction, immediately recognized it as Butler. As you can see, it's the very same pose, it's just cropped a little differently. Here you can see almost the entire cap. Here the cap is cut about in half. Some time went on, and once again, this was an unidentified image that came up for sale. Very large image. I immediately recognized it as Captain Butler. I had to have it, picked it up, and eventually got the transcribed letters from the university, which I have in my files. Captain Butler became Major Butler of the 182nd 69th New York National Guard Artillery, and he and his brother before the war had owned a liquor business in New York City. Whether it was because of that or whether he really liked the drink, I don't know, but many letters are written about send a cask of gin, send brandy, send whiskey, and he would say how he gave it out to a lot of his soldiers and entertained fellow officers with it. But quite interesting reads anyway. And the last one for the evening are these images of this young drummer. This is Frederick Klaus. There you can see a cabinet image of him. This is his GAR medal and his identification disc with its McClellan hanger. A CDV, Klaus, and Klaus in his later years. He served twice, in fact. They said he ended his life by alcoholism. He was never wounded or anything like that, but to find two images of him from wartime, the post-war image, along with the other two items, was another one of those I had to have, and it came from a picker from their family. So that is all I've got for you this evening. I hope I didn't bore you too much. I hope you enjoyed the trip around the room, and I enjoyed doing it. Look forward to meeting you, or many of you, seeing some of you again, some of you for the first time when we cross paths. All the best to you. Have a good night.